Marcus Sullivan never imagined that his decision to move to a quiet neighborhood in Portland would mark the beginning of the most dangerous period of his life. After 15 years serving as a Navy SEAL, including multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, he had earned the right to seek peace. His modest two-story house on Maple Street seemed like the perfect place to start over, surrounded by families with children playing in their yards and elderly neighbors tending to their gardens. The neighborhood of Riverside Heights had always been known for its safety and community spirit. Crime was virtually non-existent, which made it an attractive location for young families and retirees alike. The tree-lined streets were well-maintained, and the local elementary school had an excellent reputation. For Marcus, it represented everything he had fought to protect during his years of service: the American dream of a peaceful, secure community where people could live without fear. Marcus had purchased the house using his military savings and disability compensation from a shoulder injury sustained during a mission in Kandahar. The injury had ended his active duty career, but it hadn't dampened his love for structure and discipline. He maintained his physical fitness routine, waking up at 5 every morning for a run through the neighborhood, followed by a workout in his converted garage gym. His neighbors often saw him working in his yard, always polite, but keeping to himself. The local residents knew little about Marcus's background. To them, he was simply the quiet veteran who lived alone and kept his property immaculate. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow next door, occasionally brought him homemade cookies and was one of the few people he spoke with regularly. She reminded him of his grandmother, and their brief conversations over the fence brought him comfort during his adjustment to civilian life. What Marcus didn't know was that his neighborhood had caught the attention of a criminal organization that had been operating in the shadows of Portland for nearly 2 years. The Red Hawks, led by a ruthless man named Vince Carrera, specialized in home invasions targeting affluent suburban areas. They had developed a sophisticated operation that involved weeks of surveillance, careful planning, and precise execution. Vince Carrera had built his reputation through violence and intimidation. At 38 years old, he had spent half his life in and out of prison for various crimes ranging from armed robbery to assault with a deadly weapon. His most recent release had come just 18 months earlier, and he had quickly assembled a crew of equally dangerous individuals who shared his lack of regard for human life. The Red Hawks operated differently from typical burglary crews. Rather than targeting homes when families were away, they preferred confrontational robberies where they could control the victims directly. Their method involved studying neighborhoods for weeks, identifying homes with valuable contents and vulnerable occupants. They would then strike during evening hours when families were home, using fear and violence to ensure compliance. Danny Rodriguez, Vince's right-hand man, had been conducting surveillance on Riverside Heights for 3 weeks when he first noticed Marcus's house. The property appeared perfect for their purposes: a single occupant, well-maintained grounds suggesting financial stability, and a corner location that provided multiple escape routes. Danny spent hours parked in different locations, photographing the house and documenting Marcus's daily routines. The crew's intelligence-gathering phase was thorough and methodical. Jake Morrison, their tech specialist, had researched property records and discovered that Marcus had paid cash for the house, indicating significant financial resources. Tony Ricci, the group's muscle, had walked through the neighborhood posing as a door-to-door salesman, gathering information about security systems and neighbor interactions. What none of them realized was that Marcus had noticed their surveillance almost immediately. His military training had taught him to be constantly aware of his surroundings, and the same vehicles appearing repeatedly in his neighborhood triggered his instincts. He began documenting the suspicious activity, taking photographs with a telephoto lens from his second-floor window and noting license plate numbers. Marcus's training had ingrained certain behaviors that served him well in civilian life. He varied his daily routines randomly, never following the same pattern for more than 2 days. He maintained multiple security measures around his property, including motion-activated cameras that weren't visible from the street and reinforced door frames that could withstand significant force. Most importantly, he kept himself in peak physical condition and maintained proficiency with various weapons. The Red Hawks had successfully completed 7 home invasions over the previous year, each one more brazen than the last. Their typical operation involved entering through a back door or window while the family was having dinner, quickly overwhelming the occupants with superior numbers and weapons, then systematically searching the house for cash, jewelry, and other valuables. They usually completed their work within 15 minutes, leaving the victims traumatized but alive. Vince prided himself on the psychological aspect of their crimes. He believed that terrorizing victims ensured their silence and reduced the likelihood of accurate police reports. His crew was instructed to make the experience as frightening as possible without causing permanent physical harm, though several of their previous victims had required hospitalization for injuries sustained during the robberies. The decision to target Marcus's house came during a crew meeting in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Portland. Vince had grown frustrated with the decreasing returns from their recent jobs, and Danny's reports about the corner house on Maple Street painted a picture of an ideal target. The single occupant appeared to be a middle-aged man living alone, suggesting he might be divorced or widowed, and potentially keeping significant assets in the home. Jake's research had uncovered additional details that made the target even more attractive. Property tax records indicated the house was worth nearly $500,000, and utility usage patterns suggested someone with expensive electronics and appliances. The lack of obvious security company stickers on windows or doors implied a false sense of security that the crew could easily exploit. Tony's reconnaissance had revealed that Marcus rarely had visitors, reducing the likelihood of unexpected complications during the robbery. The elderly neighbor seemed friendly but appeared to go to bed early, and the houses across the street were occupied by young families who typically stayed indoors during evening hours. The corner location provided access from 2 different streets, allowing for quick escape routes in multiple directions. The crew spent 2 additional weeks finalizing their plan, studying Marcus's evening routines, and identifying the optimal time for their attack. They noticed that he typically had dinner around 7 o'clock, often visible through his kitchen window, and rarely had lights on in the upper floors of the house during evening hours. This suggested he spent most of his time on the ground floor, making it easier to locate and control him quickly. Vince assigned specific roles to each crew member for the operation. Danny would disable the electrical meter to cut power to the house, creating confusion and preventing Marcus from seeing them clearly. Jake would monitor police scanner frequencies and serve as the lookout from a vehicle parked 2 blocks away. Tony would enter through the back door while Vince came through the front, trapping Marcus between them and preventing any escape attempts. The weapons selection for the job reflected their intention to intimidate rather than kill. Each crew member would carry a handgun, but they also brought zip ties, duct tape, and a taser for controlling their victim. Vince carried a knife that he used primarily for psychological intimidation, finding that the sight of a blade often made victims more compliant than firearms alone. Marcus continued his normal routines while maintaining heightened awareness of the surveillance activities around his neighborhood. He had considered contacting police, but recognized that his concerns would be difficult to substantiate. The vehicles he had observed weren't committing any obvious crimes, and his military background had taught him that authorities often dismissed veterans' concerns as paranoia or hypervigilance. Instead, Marcus began implementing additional security measures that wouldn't be visible to outside observers. He installed pressure-sensitive alarms under rugs near entry points, positioned tactical flashlights in strategic locations throughout the house, and established predetermined defensive positions that would provide cover while allowing him to monitor multiple approaches to his home. His evening routine became a carefully choreographed performance designed to appear normal while actually preparing for potential threats. Marcus would eat dinner at his kitchen table as usual, but he kept a loaded pistol within arm's reach and maintained constant awareness of all possible entry points. He had memorized the locations of every piece of furniture in his house, allowing him to navigate in complete darkness if necessary. The neighborhood remained peaceful on the surface, with children still playing in yards and neighbors exchanging pleasantries during evening walks. Mrs. Henderson continued her routine of checking her mailbox each evening, unaware that her simple presence often served as an additional layer of security for Marcus's property. The elderly woman's schedule had become part of his mental map of normal neighborhood activity. As October drew to a close, the surveillance intensified without Marcus's neighbors noticing any change. The Red Hawks had become skilled at blending into suburban environments, using different vehicles and varying their observation times to avoid creating obvious patterns. Their confidence grew as they convinced themselves that their target was completely unaware of their presence. Marcus's military experience had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any operation was the transition from planning to execution. He recognized that whoever was watching his house would eventually move from surveillance to action, and he began preparing mentally for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. His training had prepared him for combat in foreign environments, but defending his home presented unique challenges and opportunities. The stage was set for a collision between two forces with vastly different levels of experience and preparation. The Red Hawks believed they had identified the perfect target, a seemingly ordinary man living alone in a comfortable house with valuable contents and no obvious security measures. Marcus Sullivan, meanwhile, was a highly trained warrior who had survived some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world and was not about to become a victim in his own home. Neither side fully understood what they would be facing when the surveillance finally ended and the real confrontation began. The quiet neighborhood of Riverside Heights was about to witness an event that would forever change how its residents viewed safety and security in their peaceful community. The evening of November 3rd started like any other autumn day in Riverside Heights. Marcus completed his usual 5-mile run before sunrise, noting the positions of vehicles parked on surrounding streets. One particular van had appeared 3 times in the past week, each time with different license plates, confirming his suspicions that someone was actively surveilling his property. He maintained his normal routine while mentally preparing for what he increasingly believed would be an inevitable confrontation. During his morning workout, Marcus reviewed his defensive preparations one final time. His house had become a fortress disguised as a typical suburban home. Every room contained strategically placed weapons and tactical equipment, hidden from casual observation, but instantly accessible when needed. The living room bookshelf concealed a tactical shotgun behind false book spines, while the kitchen island contained a hidden compartment with additional ammunition and communication equipment. Marcus had also established contact with his former teammates through encrypted messaging apps, creating a network of support that could be activated if necessary. While he hoped never to need their assistance, knowing that experienced operators could reach his location within 30 minutes provided additional confidence. His former squad leader, now working private security in Seattle, had offered to drive down immediately if Marcus requested backup. The Red Hawks spent the day conducting their final preparations at the warehouse that served as their headquarters. Vince reviewed aerial photographs of the target property one last time, identifying escape routes and potential complications. The neighborhood's layout favored their operation, with multiple streets providing quick access to major highways where they could disappear into Portland's urban sprawl within minutes of completing the robbery. Danny had acquired detailed utility maps showing the location of electrical meters and gas lines for Marcus's house. Cutting power would eliminate most modern security systems while creating confusion that would give the crew additional advantages. The electrical meter was located on the side of the house facing away from Mrs. Henderson's property, reducing the likelihood that their activities would be observed by the elderly neighbor. Jake had programmed police scanner frequencies into multiple radio devices, allowing the crew to monitor emergency communications during their operation. His research indicated that average police response time to the neighborhood was approximately 8 minutes for high-priority calls, giving them a comfortable window to complete their work and escape before law enforcement arrived. Tony spent the afternoon cleaning and checking his weapons while reviewing the assault plan. His role required him to enter through the back door and quickly locate the target, using overwhelming force to establish immediate control. Previous operations had taught him that the first 30 seconds were critical for determining whether a robbery would proceed smoothly or encounter unexpected resistance. Vince had selected evening, where that would allow them to blend into the neighborhood while concealing their weapons and equipment. Dark clothing and baseball caps would make identification difficult, while tactical gloves would prevent leaving fingerprints on surfaces they touched during the robbery. Each crew member carried a small backpack containing zip ties, duct tape, and other restraint materials. Marcus prepared his evening meal with the same attention to detail he had once applied to mission planning in hostile territories. His dinner provided necessary nutrition while avoiding foods that might cause drowsiness or reduce his alertness level. He positioned himself at the kitchen table where he could observe both front and rear approaches to his house while appearing to engage in normal domestic activities. The neighborhood settled into its typical evening routine as families finished dinner and children completed homework assignments. Street lights activated automatically as daylight faded, creating pools of illumination separated by areas of shadow that could potentially conceal approaching threats. Marcus noted the normal patterns of light and movement, establishing baselines that would help him detect any anomalous activity. Mrs. Henderson completed her evening routine of checking her mailbox and watering plants on her front porch. Marcus had grown accustomed to her schedule and found her presence reassuring, representing the normal civilian life he had sworn to protect during his military service. Her simple activities reminded him why neighborhoods like Riverside Heights deserved to remain safe from predators. As darkness deepened, the Red Hawks moved into position around Marcus's property. Jake parked his surveillance vehicle 2 blocks away with clear lines of sight to the target house and multiple escape routes. His radio equipment allowed him to monitor police frequencies while maintaining contact with the assault team through encrypted handheld devices that couldn't be easily intercepted by law enforcement. Danny approached the electrical meter from the rear of the property, using bushes and shadows to conceal his movement from neighboring houses. His tools included wire cutters and electrical tape that would allow him to disable power quickly while creating the appearance of an equipment malfunction rather than deliberate sabotage. The electrical box was unlocked, reflecting the neighborhood's typically low crime rate. Vince and Tony positioned themselves at opposite ends of the property, waiting for Danny's signal that power had been cut before beginning their simultaneous assault through front and rear entrances. Their timing had been rehearsed extensively, with each man knowing exactly how many seconds he had to reach his designated entry point and breach the door. Marcus finished his dinner and moved to his living room, maintaining his routine while positioning himself for optimal defensive coverage of his home's entry points. His military experience had taught him that ambush situations favored defenders who could control engagement zones and force attackers to enter through predetermined locations. Every piece of furniture in the room had been arranged to provide cover while maintaining clear fields of fire. The tactical situation was about to shift dramatically as 2 forces with vastly different levels of training and experience prepared to collide in the quiet suburban setting. The Red Hawks believed they were about to overwhelm an unsuspecting civilian in his own home, using superior numbers and surprise to control the situation quickly. Marcus Sullivan was preparing to defend his territory against invaders, drawing upon 15 years of combat experience to protect himself and his community. At exactly 8:47 p.m., Danny cut the main electrical line serving Marcus's house, plunging the property into darkness. The sudden loss of power eliminated normal lighting and disabled most electronic devices, creating the confusion and disorientation that had proven successful in previous operations. Street lights continued functioning, but the target property became a dark zone that should have left its occupant blind and helpless. What the Red Hawks didn't realize was that Marcus had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. His house contained backup lighting systems that activated automatically when main power failed, providing subdued illumination that preserved his night vision while allowing him to navigate familiar terrain. The power cut actually served as an early warning system, alerting him that an attack was imminent. Vince approached the front door with confidence born of successful previous operations, expecting to encounter a confused and frightened homeowner who would quickly submit to superior numbers and firepower. His handgun was drawn and ready, while his free hand carried the duct tape and zip ties that would be used to restrain the victim during the systematic search of the house. Tony moved toward the back door simultaneously, his own weapon ready for immediate use if the target attempted to flee through the rear of the property. The crew's standard procedure involved overwhelming the victim psychologically before he could fully comprehend what was happening, using darkness and sudden violence to establish complete control within the first minute of the operation. Marcus heard the subtle sounds of approaching footsteps on both sides of his house, confirming that he was facing multiple attackers working in coordination. His training kicked in automatically as he moved to a predetermined defensive position that provided cover while allowing him to engage threats from either direction. The familiar weight of his sidearm felt reassuring as he prepared to defend his home against invasion. The front door splintered inward as Vince applied a tactical boot to the area just below the lock, a technique that had worked successfully in previous operations. He entered quickly with his weapon raised, expecting to find a frightened homeowner stumbling around in darkness. Instead, he stepped into an environment that had been carefully prepared for exactly this type of assault. Marcus had positioned himself behind his living room couch with clear sight lines to both entry points, allowing him to engage the first threat while maintaining awareness of potential additional attackers. His night vision had adapted to the reduced lighting conditions, giving him a significant advantage over invaders who were transitioning from well-lit streets to a darkened house. The confrontation began immediately as Vince realized he was facing an opponent who was prepared and positioned for combat rather than cowering in fear. Marcus's first shot was aimed with precision developed through years of combat training, striking Vince in the shoulder and spinning him around while his weapon flew from suddenly nerveless fingers. Tony heard the gunshot from the rear of the house and increased his pace, believing that Vince had encountered resistance but would need immediate support to control the situation. He burst through the back door just as Marcus was moving to a secondary position that would allow him to engage the new threat while maintaining cover from additional attackers who might be approaching. The sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful evening quiet of Riverside Heights, sending waves of shock through a community that had never experienced violent crime. Neighbors began calling 911 while others moved away from windows, unsure whether the danger was contained to one property or might spread throughout the area. Jake heard the shots through his radio communication with the assault team and immediately began monitoring police frequencies for emergency responses. The operation was clearly not proceeding according to plan, but his training taught him to maintain his position and provide intelligence about law enforcement response rather than abandoning his teammates during a crisis. Marcus engaged Tony as the second attacker entered through the back door, his military training allowing him to transition between targets smoothly while maintaining tactical awareness of his environment. The darkened house had become a combat zone where his experience and preparation were providing decisive advantages over criminals who had expected to face an easy victim. The Red Hawks were discovering that their intended target possessed skills and determination far beyond anything they had encountered in previous operations. What should have been a simple intimidation robbery was rapidly escalating into a military-style engagement where their numerical advantages were being negated by superior training and defensive positioning. Mrs. Henderson heard the gunshots and immediately called 911, providing dispatchers with detailed information about the unusual vehicles she had observed in the neighborhood over the past several days. Her keen observation skills, developed through decades of watching over her community, were providing law enforcement with valuable intelligence about the scope of the criminal operation. As sirens began wailing in the distance, both sides realized that the confrontation was entering a new phase where time would determine the outcome. The Red Hawks needed to complete their operation and escape before police arrived, while Marcus needed to maintain his defensive position until help reached his location. The quiet suburban neighborhood had become a battlefield where training, preparation, and determination would decide who survived the night. The gunfire inside Marcus's house created chaos that none of the Red Hawks had anticipated. Vince lay wounded on the living room floor, clutching his shoulder while blood seeped through his fingers. The pain was excruciating, but more troubling was the realization that their supposedly easy target was a trained fighter who had turned the tables on their carefully planned operation. Tony found himself pinned down behind the kitchen island, his initial confidence evaporating as bullets splintered the cabinet doors above his head. This was nothing like their previous home invasions where terrified families cowered while the crew took control. Instead, he was facing someone who moved with military precision and seemed to anticipate every tactical decision the attackers might make. Marcus maintained his defensive position while assessing the tactical situation developing inside his home. Two attackers were inside the house, with at least one wounded but still potentially dangerous. His military experience told him there were likely additional crew members outside providing overwatch or preparing secondary assault routes. The sound of approaching sirens meant law enforcement was responding, but he couldn't rely on their arrival to end the immediate threat. Danny heard the prolonged gunfight through his radio connection with the assault team and realized their operation had gone catastrophically wrong. From his position near the electrical meter, he could see muzzle flashes through the windows and hear Vince cursing in pain. The careful surveillance and planning had failed to identify their target as someone with serious combat training. Jake monitored police radio traffic from his surveillance vehicle and reported that multiple units were responding to reports of shots fired. Emergency dispatchers had received several 911 calls from neighbors, and the first patrol cars would arrive within 3 minutes. The crew needed to extract immediately or risk being trapped at the scene with a wounded team member. Marcus called out to the intruders, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command situations under extreme stress. He offered them the opportunity to leave immediately before law enforcement arrived, emphasizing that their wounded colleague needed medical attention. His tone made it clear that continued resistance would result in additional casualties. Vince struggled to comprehend how their operation had deteriorated so quickly. The intelligence gathering had indicated a single occupant with no obvious security measures or combat training. Instead, they had encountered someone who fought like a professional soldier and had prepared his home for exactly this type of assault. The shoulder wound was bleeding heavily, and he was beginning to feel lightheaded from blood loss. Tony realized that their tactical position was hopeless. He was trapped in an unfamiliar house with limited ammunition, facing an opponent who knew every corner and shadow. The approaching sirens meant that escape was becoming impossible, and continuing the fight would likely result in his death or capture. His criminal experience had never prepared him for combat against trained military personnel. Mrs. Henderson provided additional information to 911 dispatchers about the vehicles she had observed during the surveillance period, including partial license plate numbers and descriptions of individuals she had seen in the neighborhood. Her detailed observations were helping law enforcement understand the scope of the criminal operation while units rushed toward the scene. Marcus heard movement near the front entrance and realized that Vince was attempting to crawl toward the door despite his wound. Military doctrine taught that wounded enemies could still be dangerous, and he maintained his defensive position while keeping both attackers under observation. The situation remained volatile until all threats were neutralized or in police custody. The first patrol car arrived on Maple Street with lights flashing, but siren turned off to avoid alerting the suspects to their exact location. Officer Sarah Chun had responded to numerous domestic disturbance calls, but never to an active gunfight in this quiet neighborhood. She radioed for backup while establishing a perimeter around the target house. Jake saw the police lights approaching and made the difficult decision to abandon his teammates rather than risk capture. The crew's survival depended on having someone free to arrange bail and legal representation, and staying at the scene would only add another arrest to their problems. He started his engine and drove slowly away from the area, avoiding any actions that might attract police attention. Danny faced a similar decision as additional patrol cars arrived, and officers began surrounding the property. He had two options: attempt to rescue his wounded teammates or escape while he still could. The sounds of gunfire from inside the house suggested that the situation was extremely dangerous, and approaching the building might result in his own death or capture. Officer Chin established radio contact with Marcus through the 911 dispatcher, confirming that he was the homeowner and requesting information about the situation inside his house. Marcus provided a tactical assessment indicating 2 suspects inside, 1 wounded, along with details about potential additional crew members who might still be in the area. Tactical units arrived within minutes, including officers trained in hostage rescue and armed suspect apprehension. The incident commander established a command post in a neighboring yard and began coordinating resources for what appeared to be a barricaded suspect situation. Ambulances waited nearby to treat both the wounded suspect and any additional casualties. Marcus maintained his defensive position while coordinating with law enforcement through the dispatcher. His military experience with joint operations helped him provide useful intelligence about suspect locations and weapons while avoiding actions that might be misinterpreted by arriving officers. Clear communication was essential to prevent friendly fire incidents. Vince's condition was deteriorating as blood loss began affecting his ability to think clearly. The shoulder wound had damaged major blood vessels, and, without immediate medical attention, he risked bleeding to death on the living room floor. Tony could hear his leader's labored breathing and realized that surrender might be their only chance for survival. The tactical situation outside the house was developing rapidly as more police units arrived and established a complete perimeter around the property. Neighboring houses were evacuated as a precaution, while officers with rifles took positions that would allow them to engage any suspects who might attempt to flee the scene. Tony made the decision to surrender before the situation became even more dangerous. He called out to Marcus and the police officers outside, indicating that he was dropping his weapon and wanted to give himself up. Military training had taught Marcus to be suspicious of surrender attempts, as desperate criminals sometimes used fake surrenders to create ambush opportunities. The incident commander used a bullhorn to communicate directly with the suspects inside the house, offering medical attention for the wounded man in exchange for peaceful surrender. Police negotiators were trained to resolve these situations without additional violence, but the presence of weapons and the wounded suspect created complications that required careful handling. Marcus verified Tony's surrender by requiring him to slide his weapon across the floor and lie flat with his hands visible before allowing police entry. His experience with detaining prisoners in combat zones had taught him procedures that ensured safety while respecting the rights of surrendering individuals. The immediate threat was neutralizing, but vigilance remained essential until professional law enforcement took control. Tactical officers entered the house systematically, using night vision equipment and coordinated movements to secure each room. They found Vince unconscious from blood loss and immediately called for paramedics while ensuring that no additional threats remained hidden elsewhere in the building. Marcus cooperated fully with their instructions while maintaining his position until officers confirmed the scene was secure. Paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Vince's condition, applying pressure bandages to control bleeding while preparing him for transport to the nearest trauma center. The shoulder wound had severed an artery, and only immediate surgery would prevent permanent disability or death. Tony was handcuffed and checked for injuries before being placed in a patrol car for transport to jail. Danny successfully escaped from the immediate area but realized that his freedom might be temporary. Police would process the arrested suspects and likely obtain information about additional crew members through questioning and evidence analysis. His best option was to leave Portland immediately and avoid contact with known associates until the situation stabilized. Jake drove carefully through the city streets while monitoring police radio traffic about the incident. Multiple units were involved in processing the crime scene, and detectives were already beginning their investigation. The crew's previous operations would likely be connected to this incident, creating additional charges for everyone involved in the organization. Marcus provided a detailed statement to detectives about the surveillance activities he had observed and the defensive preparations he had made based on his military experience. His documentation of suspicious vehicles and behavior patterns would help law enforcement understand the scope of the criminal operation while building cases against all involved parties. The neighborhood began returning to normal as police completed their initial investigation and removed the immediate threats. Mrs. Henderson was praised for her detailed observations and quick response to the emergency, with officers noting that her information had been crucial for understanding how the crime had developed. Her vigilance had helped protect her community from dangerous criminals. News media arrived as word spread about the dramatic confrontation between a Navy SEAL veteran and a criminal crew that had terrorized suburban neighborhoods. The story captured public attention because it represented every homeowner's fears about violent crime while demonstrating how military training could protect innocent civilians from predatory criminals. Marcus's actions had ended a crime spree that had traumatized multiple families across Portland while sending a clear message that some targets were far more dangerous than they appeared. The Red Hawks' assumption that a single occupant would be an easy victim had proven catastrophically wrong when they encountered someone whose life experiences had prepared him for exactly this type of confrontation. The investigation would continue for weeks as detectives worked to connect the crew to previous crimes, while prosecutors prepared charges that could result in decades of prison time. Marcus had successfully defended his home and community, but the incident would have lasting effects on how residents viewed safety and security in their previously peaceful neighborhood. The weeks following the confrontation brought significant changes to both Marcus Sullivan's life and the broader Portland community. What had started as a simple home invasion attempt had evolved into a major criminal investigation that would ultimately dismantle an organization responsible for terrorizing suburban families across the metropolitan area. The story of the Navy SEAL who turned the tables on his attackers spread rapidly through news media and social networks, capturing public imagination while highlighting important issues about crime, self-defense, and the challenges facing military veterans. Detective Lisa Rodriguez led the investigation into the Red Hawks organization, working with federal authorities to trace connections between the crew and similar crimes throughout the Pacific Northwest. The evidence collected from Marcus's house, combined with statements from arrested suspects, revealed a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating for nearly 3 years across multiple states. Vince Carrera survived his wounds after emergency surgery at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, where doctors worked for 6 hours to repair damaged blood vessels and prevent permanent nerve damage to his arm. He remained in critical condition for several days while police maintained a constant guard outside his room. Federal prosecutors prepared charges that would likely result in life imprisonment if convicted on all counts. Tony Ricci cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, providing detailed information about the crew's previous operations and methods. His testimony revealed that the Red Hawks had committed at least 15 home invasions over the past 2 years, traumatizing dozens of families while stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and electronics. Several victims had required long-term psychological counseling to recover from their experiences. The search for Danny Rodriguez and Jake Morrison became a multi-state manhunt involving federal marshals and local law enforcement agencies across the western United States. Danny was arrested in Las Vegas 3 weeks after the incident, attempting to pawn jewelry that had been stolen during a previous home invasion. Jake remained at large for nearly 2 months before being captured in Phoenix, where he had been staying with relatives while planning to flee to Mexico. Marcus found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, as news media portrayed him as a hero who had single-handedly stopped a dangerous criminal organization. Television interviews and newspaper articles focused on his military background and the defensive preparations that had enabled him to protect his home successfully. While he appreciated public support, the attention made him uncomfortable and reminded him why he had sought privacy in civilian life. The investigation revealed disturbing details about the Red Hawks' methods and the trauma they had inflicted on their victims. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who had treated several of the crew's previous victims, testified before a grand jury about the long-term effects of confrontational home invasions on families. Many victims continued to experience anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders months after their attacks. Mrs. Henderson became something of a local celebrity for her role in documenting the surveillance activities that had preceded the attack. Her detailed observations and quick thinking during the crisis had provided crucial information to law enforcement while demonstrating the importance of neighborhood watch programs. She began speaking at community meetings about crime prevention and the value of staying alert to suspicious activities. Federal prosecutors filed charges under the Hobbs Act, which addresses robbery and extortion affecting interstate commerce, allowing them to seek enhanced penalties for the crew's activities. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison, and prosecutors indicated they would seek maximum penalties for all defendants given the violence and trauma associated with their crimes. Marcus worked with victim advocates and law enforcement agencies to develop training programs for other veterans transitioning to civilian life. His experience demonstrated how military skills could be adapted for personal protection while emphasizing the importance of working within legal boundaries. The programs attracted national attention from veteran support organizations and private security companies. The Riverside Heights neighborhood implemented new security measures following the incident, including improved street lighting, neighborhood watch patrols, and a direct communication system with local police. Property values initially declined as news of the violent crime spread, but they recovered within months as the community's proactive response to security concerns attracted new residents who appreciated the enhanced safety measures. Vince Carrera was eventually transferred to federal custody after his medical condition stabilized sufficiently for him to stand trial. His criminal history, combined with the violence of the home invasion charges, made him ineligible for bail. Federal prosecutors described him as a career criminal whose escalating violence posed a continuing danger to communities throughout the region. The trial proceedings attracted significant media attention as details of the crew's operations became public through witness testimony and evidence presentations. Victims from previous attacks provided emotional testimony about the lasting impact of the crimes on their families, while law enforcement officials described the sophisticated planning and execution that had made the Red Hawks difficult to capture through traditional investigative methods. Marcus testified about his military background and the defensive preparations that had enabled him to protect his home successfully. His testimony emphasized the importance of situational awareness and physical preparation while avoiding any suggestion that civilians should engage criminals rather than contacting law enforcement. Defense attorneys attempted to portray him as overly aggressive, but his measured responses and clear explanations of his actions demonstrated the reasonableness of his defensive measures. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against Vince Carrera and Tony Ricci. Danny Rodriguez and Jake Morrison accepted plea agreements that resulted in significant prison sentences in exchange for their cooperation with ongoing investigations into related criminal activities. The convictions were seen as a major victory for law enforcement and a powerful deterrent to similar criminal organizations. Sentencing hearings provided victims with opportunities to describe the impact of the crimes on their lives while allowing families to seek closure from their traumatic experiences. Judge Patricia Morrison imposed sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison, noting that the defendants had shown no remorse for their actions and continued to pose dangers to public safety. Marcus used his public profile to advocate for better support services for military veterans, particularly those struggling with the transition to civilian life. He emphasized that while his military training had enabled him to defend his home successfully, many veterans faced significant challenges in adapting their skills to peaceful environments. His advocacy work led to improved funding for veteran support programs and job training initiatives. The broader law enforcement community studied the Red Hawks case to understand how sophisticated criminal organizations could operate undetected in suburban environments. The crew's methods had evolved to exploit weaknesses in traditional policing strategies, and their eventual capture required innovative investigative techniques and interagency cooperation that could serve as models for future cases. Community leaders throughout the Portland metropolitan area used the incident to promote discussions about personal safety, neighborhood security, and the importance of reporting suspicious activities to law enforcement. The case demonstrated how criminal organizations could exploit assumptions about suburban safety while highlighting the value of community vigilance and cooperation with police. Marcus eventually moved to a different state to escape the ongoing media attention and begin a new chapter in his life. His experience in Portland had reinforced his appreciation for peaceful civilian life while demonstrating that his military skills retained value in protecting innocent people from criminal predators. He continued his advocacy work for veterans while maintaining a lower public profile. The Red Hawks organization was completely dismantled through the investigation and prosecutions that followed the failed attack on Marcus's home. Law enforcement agencies recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen property while providing closure to families who had been victimized during the crew's crime spree. The case became a textbook example of how sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated through careful investigation and community cooperation. Years later, criminologists and law enforcement experts continued to study the Red Hawks case as an example of how military training could be successfully adapted for civilian self-defense. Marcus's measured response to the attack had demonstrated that violence could be used appropriately to protect innocent life while working within legal boundaries and cooperating fully with law enforcement. The incident had lasting effects on how suburban communities viewed security and crime prevention, leading to improved neighborhood watch programs and better coordination between residents and local police departments. The Red Hawks' assumption that they had identified the perfect target had proven catastrophically wrong when they encountered someone whose life experiences had prepared him for exactly their type of attack. Marcus Sullivan's story became an inspiration to veterans and civilians alike, demonstrating how military service could continue to protect communities long after active duty ended. His careful preparation and measured response had saved not only his own life, but potentially prevented dozens of future crimes by ending the Red Hawks' reign of terror in suburban neighborhoods across the Pacific Northwest.